February 2, 1950, 2:30 p.m., War Office, London. William Scardon, MI5's chief interrogator, sat across from Klaus Fuchs in a sparse conference room and asked a question he already knew the answer to. Were you in touch with a Soviet official in New York between 1944 and 1945? Fuchs, a theoretical physicist who had worked on the American atomic bomb program, remained silent for 11 seconds. Outside, rain pelted the windows. Inside, the radiator hissed. Fuchs was 42 years old, wore a gray suit that hung loosely on his thin frame, and had been providing the Soviet Union with atomic secrets for 6 years. He had handed Stalin the bomb, and he was about to confess. The confession would reveal that the most damaging espionage operation in Western history had been executed by a quiet German refugee who held security clearances at the highest level of the Manhattan Project. Fuchs had passed detailed technical specifications for plutonium implosion weapons, calculations for uranium enrichment efficiency, and theoretical frameworks for hydrogen bomb design. He had compressed Soviet atomic weapons development by at least 3 years, possibly 5, fundamentally altering the strategic balance of the Cold War before most people knew the Cold War had begun. And he had done it while working in laboratories where security protocols were considered impenetrable, where every scientist was vetted, where trust was absolute. The story begins not with espionage in Los Alamos, but with ideology in Weimar Germany, where a physics student watched the Nazi Party destroy the democratic institutions he believed would protect civilization from fascism. Klaus Emil Julius Fuchs, born December 29, 1911, in Rüsselsheim, Germany, was the son of a Lutheran pastor who had become a socialist activist. The family was intellectually engaged, politically committed, and dangerously visible to Nazi authorities after 1933. Fuchs joined the German Communist Party in 1932, 1 year before Hitler took power. The decision was ideological rather than strategic. Communism represented organized resistance to fascism. The Social Democrats had failed. The liberals had capitulated. Only the communists seemed willing to fight the Nazis with the dedication the moment required. The Nazis won. By 1933, the Gestapo had identified Fuchs as a communist organizer. He fled to France, then to England, enrolling at Bristol University to complete his doctorate in physics. British intelligence, conducting routine background checks on refugee students, noted his communist affiliation but concluded he represented no security threat. He was a student, not an agent. His politics were idealistic, not operational. The assessment would prove catastrophically wrong, but in 1933 it seemed reasonable. Thousands of German refugees were fleeing Nazi persecution. Most were genuine refugees. Fuchs appeared indistinguishable from the others. He was brilliant. His doctoral thesis, completed in 1937, analyzed quantum mechanical problems with mathematical rigor that impressed his advisors. He published papers in theoretical physics journals. He obtained a research position at the University of Edinburgh, working under Max Born, a Nobel laureate who recognized exceptional talent when he encountered it. By 1939, Fuchs was publishing research on problems related to atomic structure and quantum mechanics, exactly the theoretical foundation that would prove essential to atomic weapons development 5 years later. When war began in September 1939, British authorities interned Fuchs as an enemy alien. The policy was bureaucratic rather than personal. All German nationals in Britain, regardless of political history, were considered potential security risks. Fuchs spent 6 months in internment camps in Canada before academic sponsors secured his release by vouching for his anti-Nazi credentials. He returned to Edinburgh in early 1940 and resumed research. The British government, recognizing that theoretical physicists might contribute to military applications of atomic physics, began recruiting scientists for projects related to military applications of atomic physics. The atomic bomb program, codenamed tube alloys, began in Britain in 1940 after refugee physicists, particularly Rudolf Peierls and Otto Frisch, calculated that a critical mass of uranium-235 could produce an explosive yield equivalent to thousands of tons of TNT. The calculation changed atomic physics from a theoretical curiosity to a military urgency. If the physics allowed explosives, Germany would certainly pursue them. Britain needed atomic weapons to maintain strategic parity or face eventual defeat. Peierls recruited Fuchs in May 1941. The recruitment was logical from Peierls' perspective. Fuchs was a skilled theoretical physicist who understood quantum mechanics and could contribute to calculations about chain reactions, critical mass, and explosive yield. His German nationality was irrelevant because he was a proven anti-Nazi refugee. His communist politics were noted but dismissed as idealistic socialism rather than operational commitment to Soviet intelligence. The security vetting was cursory. Britain was fighting for survival. Every competent physicist was noted. Fuchs was cleared for work on the most secret military program in existence. He contacted Soviet intelligence in August 1941. The approach was methodical rather than impulsive. Fuchs recognized that Britain's atomic bomb program represented strategic information that would determine post-war power relationships. If only the Western powers possessed atomic weapons, they would dominate global politics, potentially threatening the Soviet Union. Fuchs, ideologically committed to communism, believed the Soviet Union deserved access to atomic weapons technology to maintain strategic balance. He contacted Jürgen Kuczynski, a German communist exile in London with connections to Soviet intelligence. Kuczynski arranged a meeting with Simon Kramer, secretary to the Soviet military attaché and NKVD officer operating under diplomatic cover. The first meeting occurred in London in late 1941. Fuchs provided general information about British atomic research, nothing detailed enough to compromise security, but sufficient to demonstrate access to valuable intelligence. Soviet intelligence, initially skeptical, recognized the potential value. The NKVD assigned Ruth Kuczynski, Jürgen's sister, as Fuchs's controller. She operated under the codename Sonia, ran an espionage network from her home in Oxford, and managed multiple agents providing military and scientific intelligence. The tradecraft was primitive by later standards. Fuchs met Sonia at prearranged locations, passed documents in cafes or parks, and received no payment for the information he provided. The espionage was ideologically motivated rather than mercenary. Fuchs believed he was serving a larger cause, ensuring that post-war strategic balance wouldn't depend on Western nuclear monopoly. Soviet intelligence recognized they had recruited a source with access to information of incalculable strategic value. The challenge was to exploit that access without alerting the British security services. By 1943, British atomic research had advanced sufficiently that American scientists invited British colleagues to join the Manhattan Project, the American program to develop nuclear weapons. Fuchs, as one of Britain's most capable theoretical physicists working on atomic problems, was included in the British delegation sent to the United States. American security officials conducting background checks reviewed Fuchs's file and saw a German refugee physicist with anti-Nazi credentials and British security clearance. The vetting was perfunctory. If British intelligence had cleared him, American security accepted that judgment. Fuchs received clearances for work at Columbia University in New York, then at Los Alamos in New Mexico. The security failure was systemic rather than individual. Manhattan Project security, while extensive, assumed that cleared scientists could be trusted absolutely. The screening process identified obvious risks. foreign nationals without established records, individuals with suspicious associations, and people whose loyalty seemed questionable. Fuchs had none of these markers. He was vetted by British intelligence, sponsored by respected scientists, and had demonstrated anti-Nazi commitment through personal sacrifice. The possibility that ideological commitment to communism might motivate espionage wasn't adequately considered because American security culture didn't recognize ideology as a motivation comparable to money or coercion. Fuchs arrived in New York in December 1943. Soviet intelligence alerted through channels in London that a valuable source was relocating to America, arranged for Harry Gold, an American courier working for Soviet intelligence, to contact Fuchs. The initial meeting occurred in Manhattan in January 1944 on a street corner that Gold had memorized from instructions provided by his Soviet handlers. The recognition protocol was simple. Fuchs carried a tennis ball, Gold carried a book with a green binding. The two men met, walked briefly, and established procedures for future meetings. Gold would collect documents from Fuchs at prearranged locations. Fuchs would provide whatever technical information he could remove from secured facilities. The documents Fuchs provided were comprehensive. Starting in early 1944, he passed detailed technical reports about gaseous diffusion processes for uranium enrichment, theoretical calculations about critical mass requirements for uranium-235 and plutonium-239, and design concepts for implosion mechanisms that would compress fissile material to supercriticality. The information was extraordinarily valuable because it represented years of research compressed into documents that Soviet scientists could analyze and verify without conducting the expensive experimental work that American scientists had required. Los Alamos, where Fuchs was assigned in August 1944, represented the heart of American atomic weapons development. The facility, isolated in the New Mexico desert and secured by military police, housed the theoretical and experimental physicists designing the actual weapons. J. Robert Oppenheimer directed the laboratory. Edward Teller, Hans Bethe, Enrico Fermi, and dozens of other brilliant physicists worked on overlapping problems related to initiating and sustaining nuclear chain reactions in weapons small enough to be delivered by aircraft. Fuchs worked in the theoretical division, calculating implosion dynamics and explosive yields. His specific assignment involved analyzing how conventional explosives could compress plutonium cores to densities sufficient for supercritical chain reactions. The problem was extraordinarily complex, requiring sophisticated mathematical analysis of shock waves, material properties under extreme pressure, and neutron behavior in compressed fissile material. Fuchs was ideally qualified for this work. He was also ideally positioned to understand the complete weapon design, not just isolated components. The espionage continued through 1944 and into 1945. Fuchs met Gold at prearranged locations during trips to Santa Fe and Albuquerque. He passed documents containing technical specifications, experimental results, and theoretical analyses. The information included detailed drawings of the plutonium implosion bomb that would be tested at Trinity and used against Nagasaki. Soviet scientists receiving this intelligence gained understanding of weapon design that would have required years of independent research to develop. The Trinity test, July 16, 1945, demonstrated that the implosion design worked. The plutonium core, compressed by precisely timed conventional explosives, achieved supercriticality and produced a yield of approximately 20 kilotons. Fuchs witnessed the test from a distance of 20 miles, observing the characteristic mushroom cloud and experiencing the delayed shock wave. He understood immediately that atomic weapons had transitioned from a theoretical possibility to operational reality. He also understood that Soviet scientists receiving his reports would be analyzing the same technical data and developing their own weapons based on proven American designs. The Nagasaki bombing, August 9, 1945, used a weapon nearly identical to the Trinity device. The implosion design that Fuchs had described in documents passed to Soviet intelligence had destroyed a city and killed approximately 70,000 people. The strategic implications were clear. Atomic weapons represented force projection capabilities that rendered conventional military superiority partially obsolete. Whichever nation possessed atomic weapons could threaten any adversary with destruction. The post-war international order would be determined by who controlled atomic weapons and how many weapons each nation possessed. Fuchs returned to Britain in 1946, assigned to work at Harwell, the British atomic energy research establishment. Soviet intelligence maintained contact through Alexander Feklisov, an NKVD officer operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy in London. The meetings continued through 1947 and into 1948. Fuchs provided information about British atomic weapons development and critically about theoretical work related to hydrogen bombs, fusion weapons with yields potentially measured in megatons rather than kilotons. The hydrogen bomb information was particularly valuable. American scientists, particularly Edward Teller, were developing concepts for fusion weapons that would use fission explosions to initiate fusion reactions in lithium deuteride. The physics was extraordinarily complex, requiring temperatures and pressures achievable only through fission explosions. Fuchs understood the theoretical framework and passed detailed analyses to Soviet intelligence. This information would accelerate Soviet hydrogen bomb development, contributing to the Soviet Union's 1953 test of a hydrogen bomb just months after the American test. American security services began investigating possible atomic espionage in 1949, after the Soviet Union conducted its first atomic bomb test in August. The test, occurring years earlier than American intelligence had predicted, suggested that Soviet scientists had received external assistance. The weapon design used in the Soviet test closely resembled the American plutonium implosion bomb, suggesting access to detailed technical specifications rather than independent development. The FBI began investigating scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project and had possible connections to communist organizations or Soviet intelligence. The investigation focused initially on American scientists, but decrypted Soviet communications, analyzed through the Venona project, revealed that Soviet intelligence had operated a source codenamed Charles, who had provided atomic weapons information from Los Alamos. Counterintelligence analysts, cross-referencing Venona decrypts with personnel records, identified Fuchs as the probable source. British intelligence, notified by American counterparts, began surveillance and began preparing for interrogation. The interrogation strategy was patient rather than aggressive. MI5 understood that Fuchs had no legal obligation to confess and that evidence from Venona decrypts couldn't be used in court without compromising the entire signals intelligence program. William Skardon, MI5's most experienced interrogator, conducted a series of interviews with Fuchs beginning in December 1949. The approach was conversational rather than confrontational. Skardon asked about Fuchs's work, his contacts, and his political views, building rapport while gradually introducing questions about specific meetings and contacts that surveillance and Venona had identified. Fuchs resisted initially, denying any improper contacts or security violations, but Skardon persisted, conducting multiple interviews over 2 months. The psychological pressure accumulated. Fuchs understood that MI5 knew something substantial or the interviews wouldn't continue. He also understood that continued denial was unsustainable. The confession, when it came on February 2, 1950, was complete. Fuchs admitted providing atomic weapons information to Soviet intelligence from 1941 through 1949. He described the documents he had passed, the contacts he had met, and the motivations that had driven his espionage. The motivations were ideological rather than mercenary. He had never received payment. He had acted from the conviction that Soviet access to atomic weapons was necessary to maintain post-war strategic balance. He believed that Western nuclear monopoly would threaten Soviet security and potentially lead to a preventive war against the Soviet Union. His espionage, in his assessment, had prevented this outcome by ensuring that both superpowers possessed atomic weapons, creating mutual deterrence rather than Western dominance. The trial occurred in March 1950. Fuchs pleaded guilty to 4 counts of violating the Official Secrets Act. The prosecution presented evidence of his espionage activities without revealing Venona decrypts or detailed intelligence sources. The defense presented no mitigating evidence beyond Fuchs's confession and his stated motivations. The judge, Lord Goddard, sentenced Fuchs to 14 years imprisonment, the maximum sentence under British law for peacetime espionage. American officials, who would have preferred the death penalty available under American espionage statutes, accepted the British judgment with frustration, but recognized that extradition for crimes committed in Britain was impractical. The strategic damage was incalculable. Soviet atomic weapons development, which American intelligence had estimated would occur only in the mid-1950s, had occurred by 1949. Soviet hydrogen bomb development occurred by 1953, barely a year after the American test. The accelerated Soviet weapons program forced massive American defense spending throughout the 1950s, contributed to arms race dynamics that defined the Cold War, and created nuclear arsenals capable of destroying civilization multiple times over. The American response was institutional paranoia. The McCarthy-era investigations, the loyalty oaths required of government scientists, and the general atmosphere of suspicion that characterized early Cold War America all derived partially from recognition that the most damaging espionage in American history had been executed by a trusted scientist who held the highest security clearances. The security failure represented systemic inadequacy in recognizing ideological motivation as an espionage driver. The reforms that followed emphasized political vetting, continuous surveillance of cleared personnel, and compartmentalization that limited access even among cleared scientists. The British response was similar. Security procedures at Harwell and other atomic research facilities were completely overhauled. The assumption that cleared scientists could be trusted absolutely was replaced with systems that treated all personnel as potential security risks, requiring continuous monitoring. The intelligence relationship between Britain and the United States, strained by the Fuchs case, required years to rebuild, as American officials questioned whether British security procedures were adequate for protecting sensitive information. Fuchs served 9 years of his sentence before being released in 1959. He emigrated immediately to East Germany, where he resumed work as a theoretical physicist. The East German government, recognizing his contributions to Soviet weapons programs, provided a research position and official recognition. Fuchs continued working in theoretical physics until retiring in 1979. He died in 1988, having lived long enough to witness the end of the Cold War, which his espionage had helped create. The debate about Fuchs's motivations and impact continues. Some historians argue that Soviet scientists would have developed atomic weapons independently within a few years, making Fuchs's espionage strategically irrelevant in the long term. Others argue that the acceleration of Soviet weapons development by 3 to 5 years fundamentally altered Cold War dynamics, contributing to crises that might have been avoided if the nuclear balance had developed more gradually. The counterfactual cannot be resolved because we cannot know what history would have looked like without Fuchs's espionage. What is undeniable is that Fuchs provided the Soviet Union with technical information of extraordinary value at minimal cost to Soviet intelligence. He was never paid. He required minimal handling. He provided information voluntarily based on ideological commitment rather than coercion or financial incentive. From a counterintelligence perspective, he was the ideal agent, highly placed, ideologically motivated, and operationally secure. From a security perspective, he was the nightmare scenario, a trusted insider with access to the most sensitive information in existence, motivated by an ideology that security vetting hadn't recognized. The Manhattan Project employed approximately 125,000 people at its peak. Of these, probably fewer than 100 had access to complete weapon designs. Fuchs was one of them. The concentration of sensitive information in small numbers of highly cleared scientists created vulnerability that Soviet intelligence exploited systematically. Fuchs wasn't the only Soviet source in the Manhattan Project. David Greenglass, Theodore Hall, and others also provided information to Soviet intelligence, but Fuchs's access was more comprehensive, his understanding deeper, and his contributions more significant than any other Soviet source. The hydrogen bomb information Fuchs provided may have been his most strategically significant contribution. Fission weapons, while destructive, had yields limited to hundreds of kilotons. Fusion weapons had theoretically unlimited yields, potentially reaching tens of megatons. The physics required to achieve fusion was extraordinarily complex, requiring years of theoretical and experimental work. Fuchs's reports on American hydrogen bomb research gave Soviet scientists a framework for their own development, potentially accelerating Soviet fusion weapons by years and contributing to the thermonuclear arsenals that defined strategic stability through mutual assured destruction. The irony was that Fuchs believed his espionage promoted peace by preventing a Western nuclear monopoly. His stated motivation throughout interrogation and trial was that strategic balance through mutual nuclear capability would prevent war more effectively than Western dominance. This logic, known as mutual assured destruction, became the strategic doctrine that defined Cold War stability by the 1960s. Whether Fuchs's espionage promoted this outcome or merely accelerated it remains debated. What's clear is that he acted from the conviction that he was preventing a preventive war against the Soviet Union by ensuring strategic parity. The security failure that allowed Fuchs to operate undetected for years reflected systematic inadequacies in understanding ideological motivation. Security vetting in the 1940s focused on identifying foreign agents operating under direction, mercenaries seeking payment, or individuals susceptible to coercion. Fuchs fit none of these categories. He was self-directed, unpaid, and acting from conviction. The security paradigm didn't account for scientists who, having been granted access based on trust, would violate that trust based on political ideology that conflicted with national allegiance. The post-Fuchs security reforms attempted to address this vulnerability through expanded vetting, continuous monitoring, and compartmentalization, but the fundamental tension remained unresolved. Scientific progress requires collaboration, open discussion, and trust among researchers. Security requires restriction, compartmentalization, and surveillance. Balancing these requirements produced friction that continues in modern classified research programs. The optimal balance between security and scientific productivity remains contested. Fuchs's confession revealed that espionage could be motivated by ideology as powerfully as by money or coercion. This recognition transformed counterintelligence practice, shifting focus to ideological commitment as a risk factor comparable to financial vulnerability or personal compromise. The emphasis on political reliability, loyalty oaths, and continuous security evaluations that characterized Cold War personnel security all derived from lessons learned through the Fuchs case. The innocent assumption that cleared scientists would honor security obligations because they had been trusted was replaced by systematic skepticism. The Cold War that Fuchs's espionage helped create lasted 45 years, cost trillions of dollars, and produced nuclear arsenals capable of destroying human civilization. Whether that outcome was inevitable or whether different espionage patterns might have produced different strategic dynamics cannot be known. What's certain is that one theoretical physicist working from ideological conviction compressed Soviet atomic weapons development by years and contributed to the nuclear balance that defined the second half of the 20th century. The death ray never worked because physics imposed insurmountable constraints. The Bailey Bridge worked because engineering simplicity enabled rapid deployment. Napoleonic artillery worked because mathematical design beat traditional craft. Fuchs's espionage worked because ideology motivated betrayal that security systems designed for mercenaries couldn't detect. And the atomic bomb, which might have remained an American monopoly for years, became a Soviet capability by 1949 because one physicist believed strategic balance served peace better than Western dominance. 74 years after Fuchs confessed in a London office, the nuclear arsenals his espionage helped create still exist, reduced from Cold War peaks but sufficient to end civilization. The strategic stability through mutual assured destruction that justified his actions in his own mind became reality, preventing direct superpower conflict for decades while creating proxy wars, arms races, and a continuous threat of accidental nuclear war. Whether Fuchs promoted peace or merely changed how potential war would be fought remains debated. The interrogation room where Fuchs confessed was ordinary. The confession changed history. The spy who believed he was preventing war contributed to a nuclear standoff that defined global politics for half a century. And the security failure that allowed him to operate for years demonstrated that the most dangerous threats aren't always external enemies, but internal contradictions. Scientists who believe their judgment supersedes national interest, security systems designed for yesterday's threats failing against tomorrow's methods, and trust that once violated can never be fully restored. The atomic secrets passed in cafes and on street corners in New York gave Stalin the bomb 3 years early. The Manhattan Project, which cost $2 billion and employed 125,000 people, was compromised by one theoretical physicist motivated by ideology that security vetting had dismissed as harmless idealism. And the world that emerged from that compromise, nuclear-armed, mutually vulnerable, balanced on the edge of annihilation, was the world that Fuchs believed would be more stable than Western atomic monopoly. Whether he was right remains the question that every nuclear power still faces 7 decades after a quiet German physicist handed the Soviet Union the calculations that changed everything.